This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At the first event of our fall season on September the 11th, we welcomed back an old friend to Military History Night. Canadian author and historian Ted Barris discussed his latest book, Battle of Britain, Canadian Airmen in Their Finest Hour. Over to you, James and Ted.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. I hope everyone had a... Thank you.
Huzzah!
I hope everyone had a great summer, and it's fantastic to see such a great turnout. I have to say this is by far the biggest turnout that I've seen since I've been running this program, so I'm very, very happy to see that. But I know you're not here to see me, so I'm going to get on and introduce tonight's speaker. So he is the author of over 22 non-fiction books, mostly wartime histories. His book, The Great Escape, A Canadian Story, won the 2014 Liberis Award as Best Non-Fiction Book in Canada. His book, Dam Busters, Canadian Airmen and the Secret Raid Against Nazi Germany, received the 2019 NORAD Trophy from the RCAF Association. And his book, Rush to Danger, Medics in the Line of Fire, was listed for the 2020 Charles Taylor Prize for Non-Fiction in Canada. His 20th book, Battle of the Atlantic, Gauntlet to Victory, enjoyed weeks on the bestseller lists. In 2022, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. Please give a warm welcome to Ted Barris.
Thanks, James. I'd like to start, if I may, by recognizing the gentleman and the lady at this table over here. Today is the 11th of September, and we all have the 9/11 etched in our memories and the horror of that day around the world, and how with great energy and response and a sense of duty, firefighters in New York raced to the scene to try to save those people in peril. And in that peril, many were lost. I don't know the numbers, Al, but it was an extraordinary number.
343 firefighters, among others. Many.
What a tragic loss to New York City, to their families, to the fraternity of firefighters. I was honored this past spring to have Al Thomas and Paul and Moffat and Bill Stewart join my wife, Jane McCauley, and me on a trip to Normandy, into Belgium. We did all of the beaches and Ypres and Vimy and so on, and they were honoring their brothers. I discovered on that trip that firefighters from Canada served in the Great War and in the Second World War, and to great numbers lost. And these fellas and ladies, I'm sure all of you have been involved in this plan and program, have taken the time to track down the stories, the histories, the service of all those Toronto and Canadian firefighters who served overseas and lost their lives in battle. And they took me to graves I'd never seen before, cemeteries I'd never seen before, and opened my eyes to a story I'd never heard before. And I wanted to honor you tonight for your service, for your dedication to their stories on this very important day. So let us thank them for their service. All right. Some of you may know the name Mike Perry. Mike has been here to some of the presentations in this room. I believe he's a member. He is a dedicated Air Force nut. As a salesman, he traveled the country because the business required that he had to. And everywhere he went across the country, he would find Air Force veterans. This is starting 30, 40 years ago. Try to meet them, not to get their flight logs or their medals or artifacts, just to meet them and listen to their stories. Mike and I became friends a number of years ago, and recently, or in the last 3 or 4 years, I said to him, Mike, I said, we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of the RCAF. I said, if there's one story in the Air Force's 100 years that's not been told properly, what would it be? Boom. Battle of Britain, he said. I said, really? I said, there's a whole library of books on the Battle of Britain, but not sufficiently on Canadians. So I jumped in, and this is the result of that pursuit, thanks to Mike. And I offer a thank and acknowledgement in the opening pages. I've run into trouble already with people who dispute the fact that the Battle of Britain was the greatest air battle of the Second World War. I had people, particularly Americans, telling me, no, didn't you watch, the series that came out? No, it was the Masters of the Air, thank you. Yeah. And I said, yes, I did, and it was an incredible story. In any case, a number of people have disputed it, and that's fine. But I thought I'd start with some context. In the summer of 1940, the Leafs did it as they have often done it. They gave up the cup to the Rangers. That same summer, this man, Alfred Keith Skeets Ogilvy, who was well known in Ottawa for his fleet-footedness, and that's how he got his name, was in the middle of the Battle of Britain and played an important role. I hope we'll get there tonight with his story, because there's lots to tell. But the comparison of the athletics was kind of interesting. Also in the summer of 1940, William Stevenson is dealing with the problem of decoding Enigma and has connected with the Poles in the 1930s to get the first Enigma into the hands of the British and British intelligence. Well, it turns out that there was another connection to the Poles in the Second World War. The man second from the left, Johnny Kent, whose story I'll tell later on, left Winnipeg in search of an RAF commission, and through an interesting series of coincidences and circuitous route into combat, ends up training members of RAF number 303 Polish Squadron, the Polish connection. In Quebec, for the very first time in a provincial election, women were allowed to vote in the summer of 1940. Yeah, applaud. My grandson is applauding. Do that. That's good. You were taught well, Wyatt. You were taught well. At the same time, a woman who had never heard the phrase glass ceiling was breaking them. Elsie McGill is this woman's name, and she became important in assembling aircraft that would be used in the Battle of Britain. We'll get to her story later. Also, in the spring and summer of 1940, thousands of children from Britain are being shipped to safety in Canada, with the passenger liners bringing them, some lost in convoys that were struck by the U-boats. That same summer, Pat Sklanders, I'm alluding to his youth, 15, falls in love with flying and becomes, if not the most junior of men to get a pilot's license in Canada, certainly among the youngest. And he ends up flying with a fabled squadron, number 242 in the RAF, which was eventually an all-Canadian squadron. We'll get to them later too. So, Canadians in the Battle of Britain, that's the focus. And as I've said many times in my presentations before, the context is all there, the dry history is all there, the people generally aren't. So that's my focus, that's my approach, and that's the way I've tried to tell the story of this great battle of the first year of the war. So let's offer slightly more context, additional context. This is a fairly famous political cartoon of that period, created by David Lowe. When it was clear that Britain was on her own, he creates this wonderful cartoon of a soldier on the south shore of England with the waves of aircraft overhead and the waves of the sea, Britain very much alone. And of course, this is all preceded by Hitler's going into Poland, and then after the phony war, marching into Norway and Denmark and occupying, and then marching with the Blitzkrieg into the Netherlands and Belgium, and ultimately into France, from which we evacuated in Dunkirk in the spring of 1940, 335,000 men. It was considered a tremendous victory, but it was a retreat back to Britain to prepare for the next phase of the Second World War, the Battle of Britain.
July 1940. The German armies that have conquered Europe are preparing to cross the English Channel and invade Britain. But to win the Battle of Britain, the Germans must have command of the air. They must destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. With no air force, Britain will be defenseless. Now Britain's last line of defense are the fighter pilots. Flying with the Royal Air Force and with the Royal Canadian Air Force are more than 100 Canadians.
And we'll get to the numbers again in a minute. But let's look at what the two sides were comprised of as the Battle of Britain begins. Of course, commanding the fighter command, the fighters that would defend Britain in that summer, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Reichsmarschall Goering on the other side. Here were the resources each of them had. Fighter Command had 48 squadrons. Sounds like a lot, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, a squadron is 12 aircraft. So I don't know what the math is there, but it's a whole lot less than 5 air fleets. The British had 754 Hurricanes and Spitfires, give or take, and the Germans had 1,100 single-seater Messerschmitts, etc. The Germans had 1,300 bombers, the British 560. Essentially, the RAF was outmanned 2-1 in the Battle of Britain. Goering says, I'll clean up the skies over Britain in 4 weeks because Hitler is going to launch essentially an invasion, an amphibious invasion, as soon as that's done. Goering promises it. The battle goes for 113 days, from July the 10th to October the 31st, nowhere near the 4 weeks, nor in that same time period at all. What Hitler had planned was to invade across the Channel and in 3 days land something like 280,000 men, 60,000 vehicles, 30,000 horses, and within the 3 days be on the doorstep of London. Hugh Dowding is left with the prospect of defending Britain with those 48 squadrons, and it's his sense that bombers will always get through to their targets in some form. You can't eliminate a bomber threat completely. But if your fighters are appropriately dispersed and laid out and prepared, there will be interference of all bombers if you can get to as many of them as are attacking. So he's sensing that the best strategy is to, like a veneer, lay the RAF squadrons, fighter command squadrons, across southern England, giving some protection to everything. Essentially, air bases, industrial centers, factories, manufacturing, many of them were the ones that were building bomber command bombers, and fighters were in southern England. So they were vulnerable. So he says that the best way to protect Britain is to give us that veneer. He will run into trouble because one of his most successful squadron leaders, whom you'll meet later, Douglas Bader, believed just the opposite. Don't spread your resources thinly across the entire front. Concentrate and have much more punch with your squadrons if you gather them together into big wings. I get into the controversy of that clash in the book to a large degree. We don't have to discuss that now. It really isn't important in this story. The other thing that Dowding was depending on was his belief that the eyes of defense, the radar, the chain-home radar towers, were ideally situated. They were built in the 30s all along the east coast of Britain, not thousands of them, but dozens of them. And essentially they gave WAAFs, WAAFs, Women's Auxiliary Air Force technicians, the ability to see inbound formations on their screens here. And then they would pass that information on to plotters inland at the sector headquarters, Stanmore and Uxbridge and so on, so that they could see what was coming. And what was remarkable about this, as observed by another historian, Len Dighton, is that never before was a battle waged in 3 dimensions or with such speed as the Battle of Britain. Plotters were no more than 4, remember this is 1940, no more than 4 minutes or 15 miles behind the events of the battle as they unfolded. That's like having the internet in 1940, to deliver that information as quickly and to therefore respond as quickly. Now, the few, of course, this comes from the Churchill line, never in the field of human conflict so many owing so much to so few. Who are the few? Well, mostly British, 2,500 Britons, and we're talking mostly pilots here. 147 Poles, 101 New Zealanders, 87 Czechs, 7 Americans, and 300 Canadians, including 105 pilots and nearly 200 ground crew. A fact I stumbled over and didn't realize until I was well into the research. More than the pilots, the numbers show that ground crew from Canada kept the birds in the air through the battle, 113 days. One of the men whose story I get into in the book, and I'll just give you just a taste, a guy named John Birds, came from BC. He was working in a lumber camp, tall guy, great personality. They find him because they're looking for mechanics. They get him into the Air Force. They get him onto a ship into most of the RCAF members of No. 1 Fighter Squadron come to Britain in June of 1940, a month before the battle begins. He's among them, and he leads the ground crew at Northolt, which is where one of the centers where a lot of Canadians were, 242 for a while and so on. No, not 242, RCAF No. 1. In any case, Birds is a real character. And I have wonderful correspondence of pilots who talked about Birds having essentially the ability to do anything overnight to an aircraft. You can appreciate that the Spitfires and the Hurricanes were dashing off 2 and 3 times a day on sorties, damaged, even if they got back sufficiently that they required surgery overnight. Birds was there with flashlights because they were blacked out overnight. His crews were working with flashlights, and he had them singing Cab Calloway's, what was his famous song? Heidi, Heidi, Heidi Ho, right? Yes. Any case, he's got them singing with the flashlights, and this was how he raised the spirit of the men they were working in the dark to get the birds in the air again. That's the nature of the ground crews that I found in my search. Now, I want to talk more about the few in terms of the pilots. During the 1930s, and beginning actually right after the Great War, in Canada and in Britain, we had scaled back our attention to military production and aircraft and training. Essentially, the line of finance to the RAF and the RCAF fell to a dribble. Because, in the immortal words of Alexander Maclean, who was the minister without portfolio in the Borden government, aviation is war business. There's no place for aviation in peacetime. And so the government stopped funding the production and the training of aircrew. The RAF, on the other hand, were interested in getting more pilots and aircraft production because they sensed the war was coming. They were closer to the problem. Canada is the place where that sense of the romance of aviation had always existed. Lindbergh, Earhart, Wiley Post, all the great aviators of the 20s and 30s had captured young women's and men's imaginations, and they wanted to fly. Hence, in the 30s, just like the CNE air shows of today, there was what was called the Trans-Canada Air Pageant. And men and women who flew and did stunting essentially traveled the country to show off their abilities and their aircraft. This is a picture taken in New Brunswick at St. John. Now, in 1931, at the pageant, crowds gathered, and they weren't wandering around on the grounds at this particular time because there was a show about to begin. And so they were all behind a rope off to one side of the airfield, off to the side of the strip. And as they waited for the show to begin, a young man stepped over the rope and began to go along the outside, the wrong side of the rope, towards the aircraft. And of course, this got the adults in the crowd shushing him and telling him that he should get back across the rope. He had no business being out there. And then he leaves the rope and he goes up to one of the aircraft, a Gypsy Moth. And the adults are now shouting at him to come back. He has no business out there. He hops up onto the wing, climbs into the cockpit, fires up the aircraft, and goes roaring down the runway, zigzagging as he goes, and takes off, and then does about 10 minutes of aerobatics in the aircraft. He was part of the show. That kind of attitude got young men interested in flying for life. And coincidentally, the RAF in the 1930s began to offer in magazines in Canada, including this guy, Pat Sklanders, the opportunity. He was born in St. John or Saskatoon. He had loved magazines, aviation magazines, won a prize for figuring out a puzzle in one of the magazines, gets a set of goggles and a helmet, and he uses his time and interest in the goggles and the helmet to take flying lessons in Milledgeville, just outside St. John. And he gets his pilot's license at 15, also very, very young. But the RAF has offered young men the opportunity for what's called a direct entry scheme into the RAF to get a short service commission. Meaning that if you got there and you proved yourself able to fly and you met all of the prerequisites for the military, you were invited into the RAF, immediately got a commission, but you had to deliver 6 years of service. This is the middle of the 1930s. What does 6 years get you? Bang, right into the war. So all these young guys who are going over from Canada to Britain and wanting to fly the fastest, the highest, the most lethal aircraft, the leading edge aircraft, the Spitfires and the Hurricanes are coming offline in the late 30s, find themselves learning and then suddenly in the middle of, or the front lines of the Battle of Britain. He's among them. He jumps on a cattle boat, goes overseas, trains, suddenly comes down with ulcers, has to go back to Canada to heal himself. But then the war breaks out and he decides to try to become a mercenary, joining the Finns against the Russians. That doesn't work out. Then the Norwegians are invaded in 1940. He tries to get into the Royal Norwegian Air Force. He gets there too late. He decides then to go to the Foreign Legion in France. By that time, the Germans have invaded France. They're pushing them back. He literally has to flee for his life from France back to Britain. This guy leads an incredible story, all from barnstorming in that show in 1931. So he evacuates from Dunkirk. He becomes a member of the fabled 242 Squadron. Fabled because, how do I keep this short? In the 1930s, as war becomes clear that it's looming for Canada as well, then Prime Minister Mackenzie King doesn't want to revisit the problems and the hazards of conscription as had been the case in the First War. And when Vincent Massey, who is with the High Commission in Britain, suggests that Canada might be the location for training of aircrew, hence the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, about which I've written in a full book, was the political way out of the minefield of getting Canadians involved in another foreign war. We train everybody here, casualties will be low, we'll spend nearly $2 billion doing it, but we'll train 225,000 men in 5 years in Canada. 225,000 pilots, flight engineers, navigators, wireless radio operators, gunners, riggers, fitters, instrument technicians, all the way down the line trained in Canada. And that's the politically easy way out. Then the British say, but wait a minute, we're about to enter the Battle of Britain. We want to have all members of the Commonwealth represented. King says, we're not sending a squadron, not now anyway. And so the British say, fine, we'll form a squadron. They take an orphaned one, 242, and they take all those young men like Pat Sklanders and all the others, 118 of them who've gone to the RAF in the 1930s to join and be part of the military. We'll make them, the Canadians, part of a Canadian squadron. They put them all in 242. They go to France, they fight, and are, like all the others, retreating and leave most of their equipment in France, their tools, even most of their clothing behind in the evacuation from France. And now they come back to Britain in June of 1940, disheveled, disheartened, and they feel completely dispossessed. And who does the Royal Air Force decide to put in command then of number 242? None other than the famous legless fighter ace, Douglas Bader. And his story is captured in the motion picture Reach for the Sky. Here's a clip when Bader is assigned the job of taking over 242, the all-Canadian squadron.
Your pilots are mostly Canadians, and they've had a very rough time in France.
Everybody hear that okay?
Especially with authority. They want good leadership. I think you might be the man.
I understand, sir. I'll do my best.
Well, good luck in your first command. We shall soon need every fighter squadron we've got. The Luftwaffe seems to be gathering across the channel.
So now he arrives at Colchal and meets the Canadians, who, as I say, are pretty disheartened.
Who's in charge here? Who's the senior man? Is anyone in charge?
I guess I am.
What's your name?
Turner.
Turner, what?
Sir.
So now Botter realizes that the only way he's going to convince these guys that he's their leader, legitimately, is to show them that a legless ace can fly.
Not enough. Come on, jump to it.
Not bad. Not bad at all.
And of course, this is in the day when they didn't have digital animation to do all this. That's real flying. In any case, this is somewhat Hollywoodish version of the story, but basically, from the research and the memoir material illustrates that very point. So now what Botter has to do, having convinced them that he knows how to fly an aircraft, is how to lead them. And when he discovers that they have been left essentially abandoned with no equipment, no aircraft, no clothes, he apologizes for having confronted them and making them seem as if they are disrespectful. And he invites them to go to town, buy clothes, let's start all over again. And he begins to win their favor, and they become a very tight-knit unit among the highest scoring squadrons in the Battle of Britain. There they are in the picture that brings them together late in the Battle of Britain. There's Stan Turner, the man who's depicted in the... There's Willie McKnight from Edmonton, across Canada. But again, young men who had fallen in love with flying find themselves circuitously into this squadron and led by this legendary squadron leader. Okay, we always think of the pilots, the men who were the few. Turns out there are some great stories of women in the Battle of Britain, including Elsie McGill's. She was born in Vancouver, taught at home. Because she gets into university quickly. She graduates from the UBC, goes on to the University of Toronto, becomes the first woman to earn an engineering degree at U of T in 1927, goes on to pursue her master's at the University of Michigan, and just before she's to write her final exams in the master's program, contracts polio and writes the exams from her hospital bed, succeeds, and gets the opportunity not too long after that to work with Fairchild in Quebec, building Bolingbroke bombers in Longueuil, Quebec. She also, because she has a great mind for aviation, begins to write about aircraft design, aircraft performance. And some of those writings come to the attention of a group called the Engineering Institute, and she's immediately engaged as a member, which gives her a platform to speak about aviation, engineering, the war. And coincidentally, Canadian Car and Foundry in Fort William is given a contract to build Hurricanes prior to the Battle of Britain. All they have to do is assemble them, because the parts come from Britain, all the way from Britain to Fort William. And she's given the job, she's second in command of the engineering of the assembly of those aircraft. So in a little clip I've got for you now, there's film of the Hurricanes being constructed, and some of her quotes about engineering, about women in aviation, and about the nature of what she was doing in a wartime environment.
Airplanes are not like baby carriages. The easy acceptance of the applicability of mass production methods to airplane construction arises from sad ignorance of the problems involved. Aviation and women are taking each other seriously. The foggy, lighter-than-air mindedness that attended women's first ventures, the glaring headlines, the frenzied publicity, and overwhelming popularity of pioneers is dissipating. To our shame, we engineers devote the years of peace to designing and planning for war. To our glory, we are the group to which our country turns in times of war. Heavily upon us as individuals and as a professional unit, our national duty rests terrible and clear.
Imagine a woman in 1940 saying these things to the industry, to the country, to the politicians, to those involved in engineering the war effort. Very brave, but because of her credentials, nobody could dispute the way she saw things. Now, from that factory come the 40 Hurricanes. Before they can be assembled, she has to memorize or know so familiarly 3,600 schematic diagrams for the assemblies, 800 different assembly processes. She's got a staff of a dozen in an office and the entire assembly line crew building the Hurricanes to specification in the spring of 1940. They are then crated and shipped to Halifax, put aboard the Duchess of Atholl, and sent to Britain in June of 1940, a month before the Battle of Britain begins. So if you wonder what Canadians were flying, they were flying the aircraft that Elsie had built. Did you know that story? Didn't learn that in history class. And there's number 1 Fighter Squadron, who happened to accompany the 40 Hurricanes on their way to England in June of 1940. Ernie McNabb, their squadron leader, and all these guys, their background is slightly different. They are more traditional in their route to the Battle of Britain. They have signed up with the RCAF in the tougher years in Canada, have weathered the storm of cuts, have survived that, and end up in auxiliary squadrons all across the country. And then just before June of 40, they're all married together into number 1 Canadian Fighter Squadron on board the Atholl to Britain, and they arrive with their Hurricanes in Britain on the 21st of June, and they go to Croydon, which is their initial base. Within a few days of their arrival, with their aircraft now put together, ready for training and preparation for battle, who arrives on the scene but Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding to visit the Canadians. And he asks them, with the Hurricanes sitting on the flight line, do you have armor plating? Bev Christmas, who's one of the men in that group, says, no, sir. Do you have 2-inch thick perspex on your windscreen? No, sir. Remember, these were aircraft built from a previous generation of Hurricanes, so they didn't have all the specifications that would be required, and Dowding certainly knows what they need. And he says, well, you haven't got those? We'll have 18 aircraft here for you tomorrow, brand new with all the specs. And all the Canadians say, yeah, sure, right. Not to his face, but they doubt. The next morning, 18 shiny new Hurricanes with all those specs are there, and these guys can barely believe it. And so Elsie's Hurricanes become training aircraft, training inbound crew who are not as experienced. The bright, shiny new ones become these fighter pilots' frontline aircraft, giving them greater protection, greater speed, a better sense of a likelihood of survival. Okay, phases of the Battle of Britain. The first one is what was called, the Germans called Kanalkampf. This is attacking the shipping in the Channel. If you've read my book on the Battle of the Atlantic, you know the impact of the U-boats on shipping around Britain, mostly in the Atlantic, but certainly in the Channel as well. In the first part of the battle, from the 10th of July to the 12th of August, they ramp that up and are destroying anything that's moving on the Channel initially. So the U-boats weren't necessary. The German bombers were doing the great damage. And the fighters are attempting to protect the shipping. That quickly changes on the 12th of August to a phase called Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack, when the Germans refocus their attention away from the shipping to the RAF bases all along the south, as I showed you in that earlier diagram, scattered thinly across the south. Essentially, they had to be the targets of the Germans to destroy the air bases, to attack the factories, but essentially to avoid population centers, at least at that stage. And one of the things that they avoid, interestingly enough, are the radar towers. because the Germans think that they're inadequate, inefficient, aren't functioning very well. So in the entire Adlerangriff, the Eagle attack from the 12th of August to the 6th of September, they devoted one day's sorties to attacking the eyes of the RAF. And they inflicted some damage, but one day wasn't sufficient. And so the eyes remained. So Dowding was right. It would be one of their survival elements. And the final phase, on the 7th of September, everything changes because the Germans, in an attack on the 24th of August, overshoot their target areas and instead of hitting the docks in London, hit neighborhoods in residential areas and kill hundreds of civilians. 3 nights later, Churchill orders the bombing of Berlin. The bomber command goes, and all bets are off. Hitler orders full attack on the population of London, essentially wipe out the population centers and bring Britain to her knees. It was the greatest gift to Hugh Dowding of the entire battle, because in shifting the attention from the bases and the factories to the population centers, thousands of civilians would die, something like 40 to 50,000, I think, in the entire Blitz. In that change, the Zielwechsel, target switch, the RAF got up off the mat and fought back to win the Battle of Britain. So I'm going to shift now to the 7th, which is that critical moment of the Blitz.
By 4:15, the first wave of this mighty armada was crossing the English coast. The Observer Corps reported many hundreds of aircraft approaching. By 5:30, the first aircraft were over London's docks and the workers' houses in London's East End. The civilian population was about to experience the full force of what was to become 57 days of continuous bombardment. The Blitz had begun. For the next 2 hours, the bombs rained down. Incendiaries were dropped to start fires and illuminate the target for other aircraft armed with high explosive bombs designed to blow buildings apart. Some were fitted with delayed action fuses, timed to kill and injure civilians and rescue workers as they cleared the wreckage. But there was more to come. At 8 o'clock, the sirens wailed across London once again. The bombers were coming back, over 300 of them. For hours, they pounded the docks and surrounding areas. In 1935, the Home Office began encouraging civilians to volunteer for a newly established corps of men and women under the umbrella of air raid precautions. The service brought together a diverse range of skills that would be needed in the event of a mass bombing attack. A women's volunteer service was formed so that women could work alongside the men as observers and fire watchers.
Now, I'd never heard about a fire watcher. I'd heard about the fire brigades and the pumps and the big operations, but I never knew what a fire watcher was until I met Dorothy Firth Marshall, who just celebrated her 102nd birthday living on St. Clair. And my colleague Matthew and I met her to get the clip you're about to see. She was born in Scotland, moves to London, Surrey, Richmond, Surrey, a suburb of London, graduates from high school just as the war begins, can't go to university, must volunteer somewhere. She tries the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. She's essentially told to stay put because the volunteer work will come to you. And so she becomes a volunteer in a number of ways, but she works initially going downtown to Barclays Bank. So she commutes from Surrey downtown to Barclays every day. She's doing some volunteer work at Waterloo Station where soldiers are passing through by the thousands, going here, there, and everywhere, giving them food and coffee and donuts. And then when she's finished volunteering there, she comes home and begins to prepare herself for her evening's volunteer work as a fire watcher.
I was called up. So that became a very important duty to the authorities of where you lived. So it was called up for Richmond, Surrey, of that area. And so you went on your duty. They gave you this dreadful uniform I told you about, serge blue, maybe white shirt, although in the fire department, and a jacket, tin helmet, gas mask, lisle stockings and black shoes. We would arrive there, and of course the firemen, you know, they'd probably had a rotten day or something, and they just sort of said, well, you do this and you do that, and there was the bucket and the sand and the shovel, and whatever you were told to do, you did. The whole idea was that if there were any incendiaries, that you put them out with your sand and your... But you never knew, you see, if the siren would go off. And it was always a nasty sight, a horrible feeling when the siren went off, because you never knew how fast the Germans were coming.
What did the incendiaries look like?
Well, they just came raining down like water, pingo, just lighted, little. But from what I can remember, they just came down like in a shower. That's right, had flowers just in, and they could start a fire anywhere. Of course, they were aiming for houses.
What were you supposed to do as you faced those incendiaries? What was your job?
Well, try and put them out. Well, I wasn't very good at that. But I got the water going and everything. But I really wasn't a very good firefighter. I was much better, really, probably looking after people than bombs.
Now, I don't know if you saw in the shot, the still shot that Matthew and I put together for this clip. She's got this horrible. He was more worried about the serge jacket and the lisle stockings, not necessarily making her look very good, than she was about what she had to do. To put out incendiaries, which burned at the height of their explosion or their ignition to 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, she was given a bucket of sand, a shovel, and a stirrup pump to essentially squirt water on these incendiaries. And she did this throughout the Blitz for the 57 days. And I almost missed it in my interviewing with her. And Matt, my colleague, former student of mine at Centennial, he's now working with Wounded Warriors as their creative director. We went and spent some time with her, and I can't remember a more delightful afternoon than listening to Dorothy talk. Oh yeah, she said when she turned 100 2 years ago, she got an invitation from the Queen to go to a garden party in Buckingham Palace. She said, I went to a garden party with the Queen and 6,000 of her best friends. Okay, I want to tell you about the guy who hooked up with the Poles, Johnny Kent. Like all these others, young, falls in love with flying, one hangar, one gypsy moth operation in Winnipeg. He gets his mom and dad to finance his flying lessons. He goes up with Connie Johansson, who's a First World War pilot, who looks at his first solo, lives through it, and says that was god-awful. Doesn't believe this kid's ever going to fly, but he keeps working at it, and eventually he gets his license. Number 919, he bragged that he got his private pilot's license earlier in his flying career than Billy Bishop did. And it's true, he did. And then he, like all the others, takes the offer in the direct entry scheme to become a commissioned officer, but he goes a lot earlier than many of the others. He's there in 1936. So he gets assigned to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, flying these. This is a Fairey P434. I've never seen it before. I've seen a Fairey Battle, and they're very similar because they're related by the same manufacturer. And his job, among many, was as a test pilot and instructor, and he was told to come up with a scheme to test Britain's barrage balloons. These are barrage balloons. How do you test barrage balloons? Well, they're designed to prevent low-flying aircraft from getting through. How do you make sure they're working well? He determines the only way to do that is to collide with them intentionally. He does it 300 times successfully without a mishap. He gets an Air Force Cross goes to Buckingham Palace to be given it by George VI himself, but he still wants to fly in combat. They send him off to do photo reconnaissance. They give him a Spitfire that's trimmed down. It has no guns. It has no armament. It has no radio. All it's got is cameras. And he's to fly at 28 or 30,000 feet, if he can get that high, over Germany, take photographs, and come back safely. So he has his wits and his speed and agility in the aircraft. Oh yeah, the other thing, they helped him by painting the aircraft sky blue so that it would disappear into the sky, right? But finally, just before the Battle of Britain begins, he's posted to RAF 303 Squadron, an all-Polish squadron. These are young men who have survived fighting in Poland in 1939 and fled to Britain to save themselves. And they, like the Canadians, are thrown into a squadron out of harm's way, as it were. And ridiculously so, because these young men had more experience than many of the men who were their senior officers, including Kent, who's now told to train these guys on British aircraft. He goes there, none of them speak any English. So he comes up with a way of phonetically dealing with them. He goes around the airplane and says, aeroplane, and the Poles say, samolot. And he writes this down on a pad that he can put on his hip, on his thigh, as he's flying, training these guys in the air, calling out on the RT, the radio, the commands, the directions, the formation tactics, and all the rest of this in this phonetic language so that they can understand. Now, the real problem for the Poles is that their aircraft were technically different from the British. In a Polish aircraft, for example, in the cockpit, in order to accelerate, you pulled the throttles toward you. In a Hurricane or a Spitfire, it was the opposite. You pushed them away to increase power. You can imagine what that would be like if your instincts told you to do one thing and you did the wrong one. The other thing was, the Poles had all worked in metric. Meters, liters, not miles and gallons. They had to convert to all of that. And the final problem was, the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, unlike the Polish aircraft, had retractable undercarriages, which meant when they took off, the landing gear folds into the belly of the aircraft. However, if you forget to open the landing craft on the way down, you do a belly landing and it's a mess. And this happened as he was training. So now, Kent is training these young guys, and the incident of early in their final assignment getting into the Battle of Britain is captured in the movie The Battle of Britain. Not exactly accurately, but you get the sense of it. So Kent is up with his Polish pilots, and he's teaching them formation flying, dogfighting, evasion, all the stuff that they're required to do. And clearly, he's teaching young men who have had much more experience doing this stuff than he has. But he has to go through the regimen of proving to the RAF standards that these guys can fly their aircraft. So here's the scene in the movie in which a British officer, not Johnny Kent, is depicted dealing with the fact that they're in this training session and the Poles suddenly see a formation of bombers.
Crying out loud. 2, repeat please. 3, 0. Repeat please. Repeat please. Now just shut up, the lot of you, and follow me. Unless you're blind as well as... Oh, God's truth.
Wacht, dass er rauskommt! Mach schon!
One. The RAF is not a flying circus.
Po pierwsze, lotnictwo brytyjskie nie jest latającym cyrkiem.
2. Strict RT procedure will be observed at all times.
Po drugie, procedura radiowa będzie ściśle przestrzegana przez cały czas.
And it is never, repeat, never to be used.
I nigdy, powtarzam, nigdy nie będzie używana
for private Polish chit-chat.
Na prywatne polskie rozmówki.
Finally, and God alone knows why, I've received the following signal. Congratulations. As of today, this squadron is operational. Signed, Keith Park, Air Vice Marshal, AOC 11 Group.
Except that that's not exactly how it happened. It makes great comedy and a very important film. Essentially what happened was Kent brings them back after they've shot down 2 bombers, having left the formation, but having sought permission from their squadron leader, a step up from Kent, a guy named Kellett. And Kellett says, go. They go. They knock down 2 bombers. They go back. And it's Kent who asks Keith Park if these men in the Polish squadron can now be declared operational. And of course he says, given what I've just seen, of course they can. So we all know that, come on in. There's some seats up here. We all know that facts never get in the way of telling a good story. So Hollywood essentially makes it the rather lighter moment that it probably wasn't. And here is the squadron that Johnny Kent leads, or a flight of them. They, in 42 days of combat, from August through till mid-September, score higher than any other squadron in the entire Battle of Britain. 126 German aircraft shot down by the guys who didn't know about undercarriages and miles and leaders and all that stuff, and who Kent knew were much more experienced than he was. In fact, most of them were aces before Kent became an ace towards the end of the battle. And he recognized that they were extraordinary airmen. And they were on a mission. And there's some wonderful moments when that clash of the Poles' dedication and bloodthirsty hatred of the Germans emerges in the deliberations between the flight commander, Kent, and the trainees, the Poles. So I come to the end by summing up the damage. This is the famous monument to the Battle of Britain in London along the Thames. In the Battle of Britain, 1,000 Allied aircraft were lost, nearly 2,000 German aircraft. The memorial remembers nearly 3,000 Allied airmen who served in the Battle of Britain. 544 were killed, including 20 of the Canadian pilots. The Luftwaffe lost 2,600 aircrew, principally because in every aircraft they were flying, or at least the bombers, there was more than one man, 2, 3, 4, 5 men in some of those bombers, hence the larger numbers. But the sad fact was, this was our first last stand. There would be many more, and there were still 1,749 days of war ahead. So the Battle of Britain kind of gets lost in the history of the war, and certainly the Canadians are lost in the few, but they were very much larger than life. Thank you very much. I apologize that the presentation is a little bumpy. I've only done it, this is my 3rd time through it. So I hope it was, I hope it was up to your standard and mine. In any case, we got time for questions. Come on in and sit down. Don't be shy. Okay, good. Any questions? Yeah. I have, no, this isn't a Frank Zappa question, I hope.
No, Frank Zappa. That's an inside joke. Ted, in your opinion, had Hitler not made the huge mistake of changing his strategy from bombing the RAF fighter bases to bombing the cities, would that have dramatically changed the outcome of this battle?
I can only gauge by what I read in terms of Dowding's assessment, some of it during the battle, some of it after in his memoirs, that he sensed that he couldn't believe the gift. Because essentially in the first half of the battle, from July to the beginning of September, or thereabouts, late August, it had been a battle of attrition. We knocked down one, they knocked down one. They knocked back and forth. And given the number of aircraft and pilots available, it was a losing game. So had the attacks on the air bases continued to the level that they had sustained in August, the RAF, and it becomes evident because a lot of the material that I read and use in the book talks about the fatigue. Because the Canadians were in the air, I think it was for something like 40 to 50 days straight. without arrest. Nothing. Essentially, they landed, they got their extra training, operational training. I mean, Butch Barton, who was with 249 Squadron, when asked how he got his Spitfire and how the training went, he said, no, they just sent me to the factory. They pulled one out onto the flight line. I had to hop in and fly it back to the airbase. So essentially, these guys learned on the fly, if pun intended, and had that skill and ability not come through. And essentially, they had to try to avoid engagement with German fighters. Their job was to attack the bombers. Dowding had spread them thinly to do damage to the bombers, not to engage the fighters. Now, they engaged the fighters because the Germans engaged them. And the Germans always had the height advantage. Hurricanes could only fly to about maybe 18 or 20,000 feet max. The Messerschmitts were 10,000 feet above them. And if they flew out of the sun, all the worse. And so that battle of attrition would have ended in disaster had the decision to shift the target to London not occurred. Now, there were other factors which become evident, including the fatigue and all those other things. They were bringing young men into fighter command, into operational aircraft, Hurricanes and Spitfires, with fewer than 20 hours in the cockpit. I mean, they had trained had more hours in training aircraft, but not in the fighters themselves. And they were lost, many of them, in their first sorties. So it was an incredible time of, and Dowding talks about it's being a knife's edge of going one way or the other. And there's that wonderful moment that's depicted in most other history books and in the movie when Churchill and Clementine are at Stanmore and they're watching the plotting tables and they're looking at Keith Park, who's looking pretty grim. And Churchill says to Park, have we any reserves? Because there's so much up in the air on September the 15th. And he says, there are none. Everything we've got is in the air. Had they lost it on the 15th, it would have been curtains. But by that time, the shift to the population centers, to London and Birmingham and Bristol, and all the places that were not only population centers, but also had factories, that shift was a blunder, I think. Yes?
Ted, can you explain when and why number 1 Canadian Squadron becomes 401?
I don't know why, but it happened in October. They moved to Prestwick. Prestwick? I think Prestwick. They are so fatigued that the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corpsman, who is administering them medicine and taking care of their health, because a lot of them got flu and colds and air sickness and so on. He's saying by the latter part of October that these young men cannot go any further. They are then moved to Scotland, number 1 fighter squadron, after its service, and they weren't highest scoring, but they certainly did admirably, and their scores were certainly up there. They're moved to Scotland, and it's then that the numbers changed to 401, and I don't know why. That's something I can't tell you. Somebody asked me the other night whether all the 400 series highways were named after the 400 squadrons and I said, no, I don't think so. It's because in the original design of the 401, it was 4 lanes. Yes, does anybody else know?
Yes, the prefix for Canada was 400.
But where did that come from?
Because they had the other Commonwealth countries to account for as well, not to confuse number 1 New Zealand, number 1 Australia,
right.
Number 1 REM. So each dominion was given a separate...
So it was kind of arbitrary.
So it was arbitrary in the sense that we weren't 201, we weren't 301, we were 401.
Yes, sir.
The Germans and the RAF had sergeant pilots. Did the RCAF, or were they all commissioned?
There were many sergeant pilots. In fact, there were many sergeant pilots in the RCAF who were aircraft pilots leading. They were the commander on board aircraft, and they had officers behind them.
At some point, that must have changed because it's not that way now.
Oh, I don't know what it is now, but you're right. And it was a strange way of promotion, but many of the men who came into Bomber Command were sergeant pilots as pilots. I mean, you could be a sergeant pilot and be a wireless radio operator, or a sergeant pilot gunner, or a sergeant pilot bomb aimer. But if you were an officer, that would be probably because of your seniority. But remember, too, Bomber Command was losing many more men in the early days of Bomber Command, and many men were rising very quickly, and they needed officers to lead in those situations. Sir?
Yeah, I can answer your question.
Please do.
The reason was that, exactly as you said, that the RAF had a very clear distinction between their officers and their non-commissioned officers who flew, and they still do. And that is, they give them a different rank and pay them such. Many of the Canadians who were enlisted originally in the RCF, but those who were enlisted in the RAF were sent there to Britain, and they learned, they were flying, as you said, sergeant pilots. I had friends who, his pilot was a sergeant, but the navigator was a flight lieutenant.
Yep.
And he was the sergeant pilot, was 18 years old.
Yep.
And he was in command of his bomber.
That's right.
He was a Canadian. Okay. The Canadians later, particularly after the desert situation, where a large number of Canadians were serving in the desert, including Edwards, for instance, who became one of our great areas. He was serving as a sergeant pilot and then a flight sergeant in the RAF, but he didn't have a university degree. He didn't fly for the RAF. He was flying in the RCF, so they had him enrolled. So he was, as you said, he was leading a squadron of Spitfires, Bergen's first and then Spitfires, and he became a leading area until when the Canadians, because we were losing a large number of people at pilots, and we discovered that the German Luftwaffe, which controlled the concentration camps for aircraft people, treated officers much, much better than the enlisted personnel.
Yeah, they weren't concentration camps. They were the holding areas for Air Force prisoners.
That's correct.
Yeah, but interesting. The other point that you raise, and it's an important one, is that there was a lot of friction between that old RAF model, that hierarchical model of chain of command and seniority, versus the incoming sergeant pilots who had risen to lead aircraft or be pilots. You remember my dam buster story? One of the dam busters, a man named Lou Burpee from Ottawa. Lou was a sergeant pilot. 2 or 3 of his air crew, or his crewmen on his bomber, one of the 19 that took part in the raid, were officers. But they were junior to him in the air. Okay, so now they're on the ground, and Burpee recognizes that the value of bringing them together in the lead up to the dams raid was to build crew chemistry. How do you do that on a base that separates the sergeant pilots, the NCOs, from the officers? Burpee said, screw this nonsense. I'm going to take my men off the base. We'll gather, socialize, get to know each other, support each other, build the chemistry. And Guy Gibson was furious. Wouldn't allow Burpee to get his commission because he was essentially violating that hierarchy. And yet, one of the strongest chemistries I found among the 19 bombers was on Lou Burpee's bomber. Unfortunately, he didn't survive. But the story is there. He's buried in Bergen op Zoom, which I'm going to go and visit next spring. But it was among the Canadians, it was really a sore spot only in the efficiency of running a crew. Not because they felt like, oh, I deserve to be an officer and the other guys can't or shouldn't. It was simply because they were given the rules of seniority by the RAF book, and they didn't necessarily like it. Good point. Anybody? Yes, sir.
There was another Canadian that had a lot to do with the Battle of Britain, but he was not an airman. And I'd like you to talk about Sir Max Aitken, otherwise known as Lord Beaver.
Right. He was in my presentation, but you'd have been here all night. Very quickly. Max Aitken grew up in New Brunswick, comes to New Brunswick as an adult, begins to get into the newspaper business, builds an empire in newspapers, moves to Britain around 1910, runs for office in the Nationalist Party, I believe, and gets absorbed into the cabinet that Churchill puts together in May of 40 as the Minister of Aircraft Production. Now, Max Aitken detested organization. He detested red tape. He detested anything that would slow down the production of Spitfires and Hurricanes and bombers. And so he breaks all the rules. And that's why Churchill loved him. Churchill said after the war, some people took drugs during the war. I took Max. And what he did was he essentially made sure that the aircraft production numbers that were expected per month were exceeded. In early part of 1940, I'm averaging this out. The number of aircraft in Spitfire and Hurricane plants that they desired per month was somewhere around 300. Right up to May of 1940, they were only producing 200 and change. So they're 100 short of production intention or expectation. By May, he reversed it. Expected 300, delivered 400. Expected 350, delivered 450. And he did this repeatedly through the war and essentially made sure that there was that. It made sure that Hugh Dowding could say to the Canadians, I'll have 18 aircraft here for you tomorrow, right? But the other thing that Aitken did, Lord Beaverbrook, clever devil that he was, Canadian, he realizes that there's a whole lot of other production opportunities out there to reinforce that flow. The Air Ministry had given a factory in Birmingham the contract to build Spitfires. And after about a year, in 1938-39, they had delivered none. Aitken goes to Lord Newfield, who runs the company, and says, you've got all this money, you've got the contract, how come no aircraft? He said, well, it's been very difficult. If you've got an idea, we'll certainly welcome it. And Aitken says, fine, you're giving me the company, I'll take it. He dismisses the guy, he takes over, and Birmingham becomes what's known as a shadow factory. Remember I told you that all the aircraft factories were in the south along the coast? The one that was the invisible one was in Birmingham, and Birmingham sustained attacks, but the Germans had no idea that there was a Spitfire factory, and many of the best air crew or ground crew, mechanics, riggers and fitters were shipped secretly from Brooklyn up to Birmingham to be part of the shadow factory. That's another thing that Max did. And the final thing that Max did was he brings into operation the civilian industrial level to do repairs. The RAF had no time, no capability of taking downed Allied aircraft, Spitfires and Hurricanes that had been, blown out of the air to pick up the remains of the aircraft. What Beaverbrook decided to do was, we need the parts. So he invented an entire level of repair at all these civilian centers around Britain, where all the bits and pieces of destroyed aircraft would be brought to reassemble aircraft. I think he built, over the course of the battle, something like 300 aircraft from the bits and pieces that they salvaged. Again, genius. And necessity being the mother of invention. He was certainly that. Brilliant guy, not necessarily the easiest to get along with, but he got the job done. Thank you for asking. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just one. You mentioned these two squadrons. During the Battle of Britain, were there other Canadian squadrons, or did they come later?
They came later when we moved into the 400 series. But there were 118 men who left Canada to join the RAF in the late 30s. And they were scattered across all the RAF squadrons, with the exception of the group that came together in 242, and then RCAF number 1 that arrives in Britain in June of 1940. So they were all across the different squadrons, and I try to bring together as many of their stories chronologically in the book as possible, including Skeets Ogilvie, who's involved in the famous attack on Buckingham Palace. You'll read about that in the book. Butch Barton, he's the guy that went to the Spitfire factory, picked up the Spitfire and went home. He got shot down several times, bailed out of his plane, walked back to his base, got into another one, took off again. I mean, these guys are just, had remarkable energy and chutzpah. Anyway, yes, sir.
What was the mean average age?
Of the pilot Canadians? Interesting question and interesting point. the Canadians in the RAF were among the eldest. Most of the RAF, by the book, entry requirements were minimum age 18, maximum 22. Ernie McNabb turned 34 during the Battle of Britain. Gordon McGregor turned 39 during the Battle of Britain. These guys were the Hartland Molson, who was in the number 1 fighter squadron, RCIF, said we were the old man business club. They were the eldest, and what's interesting is they tried to hide that fact because so many of the squadrons are saying we need young pilot officers and fighter pilots. The Canadians were among the eldest. Why? Because they had all come over earlier. They were older to begin with. And in a way, maybe that gave them maturity. It gave them the maturity to survive, but also probably the sense to, what the hell are we doing here? You know, but they were remarkable in that old man business club. Thank you very much for your attention, your questions.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.